In the frozen hell of Hürtgen Forest, November 19, 1944, Francis X. McGraw's fingers tightened on the Browning as German MG42s, Hitler's Buzzsaw, ripped through the fog at 1,200 rounds per minute. For an hour, artillery shells had hammered the American positions near Schevenhutte, Germany, yet he hadn't moved an inch. The enemy infantry advancing through the pines suddenly halted, pinned down by his relentless fire. He'd stopped them cold, but they weren't finished. A rocket suddenly screamed in, the distinct shriek of a Panzerfaust. Taking a direct hit, the blast ripped his Browning from its position, sending it tumbling into the mud. Most men would have stayed down. McGraw lunged for his weapon. The machine gun was just the beginning of what he had in store for the Nazis next. To the fighting first. Francis Xavier McGraw was born on April 29, 1918, in Camden, New Jersey. After finishing high school at Camden Catholic, he took a steady job as a machinist helper at the Campbell Soup Factory. He was quiet, dependable, and working class through and through. But everything changed after Pearl Harbor. Just 2 months after the attack, McGraw enlisted. He was 24, and he signed up for one of the toughest units the Army had, the 1st Infantry Division, or the Fighting First. It was a name that carried weight like no other in the U.S. Army. Formed in the summer of 1917, the 1st Infantry was the first to hit French soil during World War I. They didn't waste time, capturing the first American victory at Cantigny, a village just north of Paris. From May to November 1918, the Fighting First fought through the brutal battles of Cantigny, Soissons, Saint-Mihiel, and the Hürtgen Forest. During these campaigns, they suffered more than 20,000 casualties, but they never wavered. They earned the nickname the Big Red One from the bold red numeral on their combat service identification badge, a symbol that came to mean first in, last out. By the war's end, the division had paid a heavy price. Nearly 5,000 soldiers fallen in combat, over 17,000 wounded, and more than 1,000 missing or later succumbing to injuries. The extraordinary bravery demonstrated within their ranks resulted in 5 soldiers receiving the Medal of Honor. The 1st Infantry Division had carved out its place at the front, trusted to take on the hardest fights and break through where others stalled. From Normandy eastward. With a new war breaking open across 2 oceans, the Big Red One, or Fighting First, was at the tip of the spear again. With the 1st Division, Francis McGraw hit the ground against Rommel's Afrika Korps. Fighting in the open desert, they clawed through a tough enemy line, clearing ridge after ridge, town after town. By May 1943, Axis forces in Tunisia had collapsed. The Big Red One moved fast to its next target, Sicily. At Gela, McGraw landed under fire. German tanks nearly pushed them back into the sea, but the infantry held. From there, it was house to house, field to hilltop combat all over again. Sicily fell in mid-August. Next came England, where months of drills, training, and gear checks pushed the men to their limits. All of it led to one date, June 6, 1944, D-Day. Their destination was Omaha Beach, the most heavily defended stretch of the invasion. The 1st Infantry Division landed with the first wave, straight into the fire. Machine guns shredded the waterline. Mortars came down like rain. Men were blown out of landing craft before they even touched shore. But McGraw made it up to the beach and into the German lines. The Big Red One smashed a hole through Hitler's Atlantic Wall and drove inland. By November 1944, McGraw attained the rank of Private First Class. He'd been offered promotions before, more than once. McGraw turned them down every time. He had no interest in giving orders that might send someone else to their end. He stayed a rifleman, front line, no distance from the risk. So when the Fighting First pushed into the Hürtgen Forest, McGraw was exactly where he'd always been. A fight among the pines. By mid-September 1944, the Allied advance across Germany had stalled. Supply lines were overextended, and German resistance was mounting, slowing progress toward the Rhine River. The U.S. First Army, struggling at the Aachen Gap, identified the Hürtgen Forest as a potential German stronghold. The 1st Infantry Division arrived in early October, joining the push to encircle Aachen. Despite repeated calls for surrender, the German command refused to capitulate, holding out until October 21st. Defending the forest, the Germans had 5,000 men, under strength but well prepared. Their positions were bolstered by bunkers, minefields, and pre-ranged artillery. American commanders underestimated the resolve of the defenders. Optimism that the Germans were on the verge of collapse proved misguided. The Allies were also targeting the Ruhr Dam, which could flood American positions if the Germans decided to release its waters. And the Hürtgen Forest stood in the direct path to neutralizing that threat. However, conditions in Hürtgen turned the mission into a brutal slog. Thick pine trees, freezing rain, and deep mud. Air support was ineffective due to the low clouds, and the few roads were slow to navigate. Despite a 5-to-1 advantage, the Americans struggled to bring their full strength to bear. Tanks became bogged down, and front lines constantly shifted as ambushes cut down fresh American units. Veteran German troops, accustomed to the terrain, exploited every advantage, forcing the Allies to rely on grit and determination. Stuck in the grind. The Americans' swift capture of Schevenhutte in mid-September gave way to a grinding halt as Hürtgen Forest consumed their momentum. The forest became a maze of death where advances were measured in yards, not miles. The push toward Lummersdorf succeeded, but German forces remained firmly entrenched beyond. Hell 554 turned the 3rd Battalion into a shadow of itself. The 39th and 60th cut the Munchau-Düren Road in early October, but the cost was devastating. By mid-October, American casualties reached 4,500. The exhausted 9th Division rotated out, replaced by the fresh 28th Division. Their objective, Vossenack and the woods near Hürtgen. The terrain mocked their efforts. The Kahl Trail barely supported armor, turning tanks into stationary targets. The November offensive met immediate resistance. Units hit minefields and fierce counterattacks. Even when ground was gained, it couldn't be held. On November 4th, the veteran 116th Panzer Division, hardened by the Eastern Front, hammered American lines. U.S. forces retreated to Kommerscheid in disarray. American positions stretched thin. Every ridge and clearing became a potential ambush. The forest wasn't just consuming men, it was grinding their spirit. On November 19th, the Hürtgen nightmare entered a new phase. Standing against the barrage. The heavy rain hammered down on McGraw as he crouched in his foxhole, the relentless deluge soaking through his gear. His heavy machine gun, likely an M1917 Browning, a .30 caliber beast, was steady in his hands, the barrel cold and slick from the weather. The past 4 days of combat had barely gained his regiment a mile of ground, and now the Germans were coming to reclaim it. McGraw could feel it in his bones. This wasn't going to be a simple fight. The first sign of trouble came with the low growl of German artillery. Shells screamed overhead, followed by the violent concussion of explosions. Dirt and rock splattered into the air, the shockwaves rattling his bones. For nearly an hour, the bombardment continued, the Germans intent on softening up the Americans before their infantry advanced. McGraw kept his eyes trained on the gun sights of his Browning, steadying his breath. He had no time to flinch. Finally, when the barrage ceased, the silence was almost worse than the bombardment. That's when McGraw saw them. German soldiers moving forward through the rain and smoke. They advanced cautiously, trying to stay under cover while pushing toward his position. The first few were armed with MP40 submachine guns, and their movements were fast, methodical. They were experienced, but McGraw had trained for this. His fingers tightened on the trigger, and the machine gun roared to life. The distinct rhythmic rattle of the .30 caliber rounds tore through the advancing enemy line, forcing them to break apart and scatter for cover. The sound of bullets smashing into dirt and trees echoed around him, the Germans now forced to seek shelter from the relentless barrage. But the Germans adapted quickly. McGraw saw a flash of movement and the unmistakable profile of an MG42, a general-purpose machine gun known for its extreme rate of fire, up to 12 to 1,500 rounds per minute, and nicknamed Hitler's Buzzsaw. The MG's high-pitched rattle sliced through the air as the enemy gunner returned fire. The round splashed around the earth, digging into the ground near McGraw's position. He adjusted his sights, waiting for an opening. The German machine gun was hidden in a nest, but not for long. McGraw knew he had to act. McGraw rose straight up in the foxhole, defying the incoming storm of fire, and hauled the heavy M1917 into a new angle. Tracers stitched the air around him as he leveled his sights on the enemy's MG42. Then came the roar, controlled, methodical fire ripping out across the line, hammering the German position. The German machine gunner fell silent as McGraw's round struck home. The line wavered, the Germans temporarily retreating behind rocks and trees. But McGraw's relief was short-lived. No time to rest. Another threat appeared almost immediately. The sharp whistle of a Panzerfaust rocket cut through the air. Nicknamed the Tank Fist, the Panzerfaust was a shoulder-fired single-use launcher armed with a 149mm shape-charge warhead. It had an effective range of 30 to 60 meters and could punch through up to 200mm of armor. It was built to destroy tanks, but just as lethal against infantry caught in the open, as McGraw found himself in this dire moment. The Panzerfaust blast hit close. The impact rattled the earth and sent McGraw's machine gun skidding from its position. Dust and debris choked the air, filling his lungs with a gritty haze. Visibility dropped to nearly nothing. McGraw's hands, caked with mud and rain, moved instinctively toward the weapon. The gun wasn't destroyed, just dislodged. He wiped the muck from the M1917, adjusting the barrel with quick, deliberate motions. His eyes scanned the smoke-filled battlefield, his focus locked on the German advance. He was already firing again, sending a steady stream of rounds toward the enemy, forcing them to take cover. But just as he thought the worst had passed, another enemy machine gun opened fire, this one aimed directly at his position. McGraw knew he couldn't wait. With a calculated, almost reckless precision, he stood up in his foxhole again, exposing himself fully to enemy fire just to gain a better shot. His M1917 roared back to life, hammering the enemy position into silence. But now, the ammo belt was nearly spent. The German fire, meanwhile, was relentless, and it seemed like they had an endless supply of Panzerfaust shells. With each new blast, McGraw's position grew less stable, but he wasn't about to give up the ground he'd fought so hard to hold. McGraw broke cover and sprinted across fire-swept ground, bullets cracking past him as he raced to resupply his dwindling ammunition. There's no stopping now. Amidst the noise in the battlefield, First Sergeant Joseph Bruno, becoming aware of McGraw's ammo situation, later recalled that, quote, "The fire was so intense that the ammunition bearers were unable to cover the short distance to the ammunition dump, where supplies were stored in a deep trench." The urgency of the situation was clear, but McGraw didn't cower. Bruno went on, quote, "I saw Private McGraw make 3 trips to pile up supplies next to his gun. He was hit on the last trip." That's when Bruno and the others witnessed the full measure of McGraw's grit. Wounded, but still driving forward. He added, quote, "He was hit, but he didn't stop. He just kept going, even when he was bleeding." The first sergeant yelled for McGraw to stop, hold back, and get treated, but McGraw kept moving, focusing only on the fight and intent on holding the line, no matter the cost. Over the crack of rifles and exploding rounds, McGraw yelled back, quote, after the enemy stopped trying to get through. Then, another wave of enemy infantry surged forward, and McGraw saw a German soldier advancing toward him. The man was close, too close to wait for the machine gun to be effective. In a split second, McGraw drew his sidearm, likely an M1911 pistol, and fired. The German soldier dropped, his rifle clattering to the ground as he collapsed. Still, the Germans pressed on, bringing up more Panzerfausts, their rockets screaming toward McGraw's position. Another round slammed into the earth nearby, kicking up a geyser of mud, stone, and shrapnel that rained down into the foxhole. The blast caked his machine gun in wet soil and nearly buried the receiver. Working fast but steady, he cleared the action with the edge of his sleeve, fingers slick with mud. He cracked open the receiver, checked the feed tray, and began reassembling the M1917. Each movement deliberate, practiced, unshaken. Enemy fire lashed the position, but he didn't look up. There was no cover left to wait behind, and no time to spare. The line was collapsing. With the bolt slammed home and the belt fed in, McGraw locked the tripod and pivoted the barrel forward. The machine gun roared back to life, cutting through the smoke and sleet. A curtain of 30-06 rounds tore into the tree line where the Germans were pressing, buying a few more seconds for the line to hold. But ammunition was becoming scarce. The fire was intense, and as Bruno had noted, the ammo bearers had a hard time reaching the supply dump. Even if they made it, there wasn't much left. McGraw knew that once he ran dry, there would be nothing else to do but fight with whatever he had left. A fraction too slow. The Germans were beginning to retreat. Their fire was slowing down, but McGraw wasn't done. As the M1917 fell silent for the last time, he grabbed a carbine, likely an M1, and brought it to his shoulder without pause. The M1 carbine wasn't in the same league as his Browning. The heavy machine gun had delivered sustained, high-caliber fire with belt-fed 30-06 rounds. It was made for holding ground. The carbine, by contrast, fired smaller 30-caliber rounds, was semi-automatic and magazine-fed. It was lighter, faster, and easier to handle, but it lacked the sheer stopping power. Switching to it meant giving up brute force for speed. It was a risky move, but McGraw needed to stay in the fight. With the enemy pulling back and ammo running low, he slung the heavy gun aside and reached for the lighter weapon. Less firepower, more vulnerability, but better than going silent. He chambered around, pivoted toward the fleeing silhouettes, and opened fire. Even after hours of fighting, every shot cracked with purpose. One German soldier staggered as a round hit home, dropping in the mud. Another twisted mid-stride, clutching his side as McGraw's rounds punched through the fog and rain. Even as the enemy broke contact, McGraw stayed locked in, squeezing off each shot with precision. No panic, no rush, just calm, relentless fire. Another German soldier, likely a rifleman, reappeared from the smoke, taking aim at McGraw's position. The two men locked eyes for a split second, the stench of gunpowder thick in the air. McGraw drew his carbine and fired, but the shot was a fraction too slow. The German's rifle cracked, and McGraw felt the impact before he heard the shot. The world around him tilted, his knees buckled, his carbine slipped from his grasp. The German forces were pulling back, but McGraw wouldn't be there to see their retreat complete. His battle was over. Honor in a stalemate. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest raged for 88 days, the longest fight on German soil in World War II, and the second longest battle the U.S. Army has ever endured. In the end, it was a brutal stalemate that drained resources on both sides, with the Americans suffering 33,000 casualties, including 9,000 non-combat losses. The Germans sustained 28,000 casualties, many of which were non-combatants or prisoners. Amidst the carnage, Private Francis X. McGraw displayed extraordinary courage, earning a posthumous Medal of Honor on October 25, 1945. The citation emphasized how in the face of enemy fire, he bravely, quote, lifted his gun to an exposed but advantageous position atop a log and courageously stood up in his foxhole and knocked out the enemy weapon, as well as highlighting his fearless retrieval of ammo, remarking how he was, quote, wounded painfully in this dangerous task, but he disregarded his injury and hurried back to his post. At just 26 years old, Francis X. McGraw was laid to rest at the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium. In his honor, the U.S. Army named the victory ship USAT Private Francis X. McGraw, and the Munich military installation McGraw Kaserne after him. A section of Tegernseer Landstrasse was also renamed McGraw Graben, preserving his legacy. One of McGraw's trenchmates, First Lieutenant Paul C. Heath, wrote to McGraw's mother, describing how he had fallen, quote, as a soldier, in the manner he would wish, fighting on the field of battle against the enemies of our country. His presence in the line was always an inspiration to his comrades, and they miss him deeply.